welcome back to Living from the Inside Out, Life in the Spiritual Lane. We have a very, very special guest with us here today. Philippa Blackham is here with us from the UK, award-winning documentary maker, worked for the BBC for many years, also a meditator. Yeah, really thrilled to have you here with us today, Philippa.
Thanks for having me, Anne-Marie. It's great to be with you.
It's exciting to have someone who's involved or has been involved with mainstream media here, because I think that when we think about the way we get the news of our world right now, oftentimes people will say of journalists who are taught to look at situations critically, they'll often say that the media is negative, that it tells negative stories. So it's always interesting when we find uh, media folks who are also leading spiritual lives and really having been able to met things. So I'd love to start there with you. How have you been able to connect your media life with your spiritual life?
Well, both those lives actually began at the same moment. So my spiritual life began when I was 18 and I was on a gap year traveling around the world, and I came across the Brahma Kumaris in Malaysia, and they have an introductory course which lasts 7 days, which I took in 7 consecutive days, and it just clicked for me and it fitted, and it became my path, my spiritual path. I had ideas of carrying on traveling around the world, but my senior sister said, well, you found what you were looking for. You can go back to London now and get on with your life. So I was sort of transported from Malaysia back to freezing cold London in January of 82. And I'd done some work experience for the BBC and local radio during my sixth form at college. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do. So I went down and resurrected the contacts that I had and started very humbly at the bottom, just sort of doing office jobs, and slowly worked my way up. So my journey with media, with broadcasting, and with my spiritual life progressed alongside each other. And I used to feel like I was two different people for many years. I would be wearing white, meditating, living in a meditation center. And then I'd put on my black clothes and go to the BBC and start playing music and being a disc jockey and whatever else. And it felt quite schizophrenic. And my biggest fear was, what if someone from the BBC saw me in my meditation, white meditation clothes, and the other way around as well. But over time, I found an inner me that was comfortable in both and was the same person in both. But I took a decision quite early on that I didn't want to go into news or news gathering, because I saw that as quite hard, and it just wasn't a comfortable fit for me. So my whole career was in features, and I was a documentary maker, I was a reporter, I was a presenter. And I ended up going from local radio, which was in the heyday of local radio days, BBC local radio, to working for BBC national radio. And I'd have to say that there never was really a place for spirituality at the BBC. It was something they instinctively didn't understand and didn't accept. Radio 4 was a shrine to the intellect, and spirituality just stood outside that rigorous intellectual thinking. And at the end of the day, that was one of the reasons why I felt I had to move on, because I couldn't park my spiritual self at the front door and go to work as I had been doing any longer. I just wanted to be the spiritual person that I am 24 hours a day. And that was, when I made a decision to change the way I work.
Well, it's fascinating what you just said there about BBC4 being a shrine to the intellect. And I wonder if no, it's also very interesting that your your spiritual and media lives took place, grew at the same time, as opposed to being a media person and then coming to a spiritual life, which I'm sure would have been very different. But how has your spiritual sense changed the way that you look at the intellectual? Because I know that the traditional way that we think of the intellect is, I would say, associated, let's say, just for simplicity, associated with science. Can you talk a little bit about your how spirituality has maybe changed that view of the intellect, of that word even?
Mm. I mean, I have never particularly been drawn to science. I've got a good enough intellect, but I wouldn't describe myself as an intellectual. I did okay at university, but I was never going to be an academic. For me, there was always a knowing that went beyond intellectual knowing, an intuition, a sort of a direct insight. And I grew up in a very spiritual family. My mother was one of the pioneers of New Age spirituality in the UK, and she founded quite a few of the big organizations that still exist today. And she writes books, and I've got three sisters who are all very spiritual. So I was very much nurtured in that world of placing an importance on knowing the deeper self. And in some ways, the intellectual pursuit can become a bit of a distraction. It can become a place of ego and arrogance. And of course, the spiritual path is about moving beyond, look at me, I'm a great expert on X, Y, or Z, to, I'm just on a journey to discover the essence of who I am. So, yeah, I would say I'm more comfortable in a place of direct insight from lived experience, from a spiritual perspective, rather than this safety of intellectual knowledge. Not that I reject that, I think it's amazing. And I've got a nephew who is a professor, and I just have so much respect for anyone who uses their intellect. But, the intellect is only one of our capacities. We have a mind, um, and we have our personality traits. And I like to bring all of that into the mix rather than just concentrate on the intellect.
And is that maybe one of the things that was challenging then about working with the BBC is this, or not even just the BBC, but creates a challenge in an environment where it's intellect only? Is that in part a then a not a turning away, maybe a turning away from the potential to know the deeper self, um, or not inviting that knowledge of the deeper self?
I mean, I'm aware that I live in a country that has a very long, complicated relationship with religion and with spirituality. Women who possessed to have a direct connection with the Supreme, with a knowing beyond their physical senses, were burnt at the stake in their thousands. So we have a hesitancy, a mistrust. I'd say we're almost scared of that domain because you can find yourself in trouble historically very quickly. Even if you're on the wrong side of the Catholic Protestant divide, you could be in trouble. And I think today's young generation have, pretty well rejected mainstream religion, and I think spirituality has not served them well. If I look at the experience within my own family, many of my family members were following gurus in India who then turned out to have a whole backstory going on that involved, children and, embezzlement and, a whole raft of behavior that, broke the trust, broke the faith. So they don't have a huge amount of trust in spirituality. So we have an uncomfortable relationship with spirituality in this country. And as an organization that is trying to promote spirituality, that legacy follows us, and we have to be aware of it.
It's interesting that two of the institutions that used to have the highest degrees of trust, religion and media, now have among some of the lowest
Yeah.
degrees of trust from the public. So how do we, I mean, we see what's happening with media, how it's splintering, how there are so many different different places where people can get their news, how there's so many questions about what is real news, fake news, all of that. What does it look like for spirituality as that trust in mainstream religion has declined and people are still seeking? Uh, what's how are people to find, new meaning, new ways of
Mm.
finding meaning?
I think this is such an interesting question. And just coming back to the UK, we've had the head of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has had to resign because he had many vicars who he knew were involved in child abuse, and he turned a blind eye, and it came to public awareness, and he was forced to resign. Now the second person who's going to temporarily replace him, they found that he has the same story going on with him, so he can't now take the post. There's no faith, there's no trust in mainstream religion. And if I look back at the BBC, when I first started in the early 1980s, we were the voice of authority. If you heard it on the BBC, you could trust it. You could hang your hat on it. There were only three programs on the television. Everybody watched those same three programs. And there was a kind of an agreed, this is the truth as we, as a humanity, as a community see it. Now that has, as you say, it's gone so fragmented, and there are benefits in that because anyone can now become a content creator. Anyone can put their story out. And so you've got much more diversity, you've got much more inclusion, um, you've got voices and opinions that would never have been heard within the fortress of the BBC in the olden days. But what comes with that is the dilution of the message of the story, and we've gone from a world of truth to a world of post-truth, and now we're rapidly entering a world without truth, a world without facts. So what can you trust in today's media world? And the variety and the choice is so overwhelming. Where do you even begin? So this kind of dilution has been going on, for the past 20, 30 years. And where does spirituality fit into that? Because, promoting a message of sitting still, sitting quietly, of going beyond the ego, going beyond the self is the opposite of what we see happening in media today, because it's all about being the loudest, getting your story across in the most, eye-catching way. It's personality driven, it's how you look driven. All of these things, spiritual groups don't necessarily tick the boxes. But I feel like we're entering a time when we're reaching the zenith of false truth. It almost can't keep expanding any further into this explosion of content, none of which can be relied on. And the image I have in my mind is of the yin yang of Buddhism, where you have half black and half white. And in the black part is a little white circle, and in the white part is a little black circle. And I feel that the spiritual community is that little white circle that is holding the truth, is holding the deeper knowledge, the deeper understanding of the self, and that it's going to come a time where we cannot expand any more into falsehood, and the pack of cards will begin to fall, and the voice of truth of spirituality will in a way be the last man standing, the last woman standing. And at that time, people will really come to see and appreciate the value of what the spiritual voice has to offer. And I don't think that's very far away. I can feel that change, the tipping point begin to happen. And in order for that to pass over into the other side, it doesn't need for everyone to become spiritual. It just needs the right number, the significant tipping point number for that to then tip over. So, I feel like we're holding a candle in the dark, and our job is to keep the oil in the oil lamp going and keep our flame alight. And as things around us begin to collapse and fall apart, we can take a step forward and offer a solution that people are not interested in at the moment, or at least not in sufficient numbers.
So the picture that you've painted of the going from the voice of authority down to now this post-truth, to there being no truth. So
Mm.
where what can we trust right now? Where do we go to find some solid ground in the midst of all of this uncertainty?
It's a world that is spinning very fast, and people are being spun off in the process. If we look at what's happening to the economic picture, to the environmental picture, to people's own health, mental well-being, it's all, the cracks are more than showing, things are falling apart. And so where do you turn for inspiration, for comfort, when the organizations that have always been there are no longer serving in the way that they were and can no longer command our respect and trust? So again, another image that I like to hold is just in the same way as we have a sun at the middle of our universe and all the planets that spin around. It's like anything that is involved in a process of constant change, which our world is, has to have a still point at the heart of it in order for the spinning to take part. And in the spiritual world, we have the same principle operates, in that the still point is the unchanging, the divine, the mind of purity, of truth, of absolute truth, of peace, of all the qualities that we are looking for. There has to be a point which contains the essence of all of that and is still and is unchanging. And around that, we are all spinning and spinning out of orbit, but there is that stillness. So in our meditation practice, we learn to connect to that still point. And it's a bit like a rock that is in the middle of the ocean with waves pounding all around it, and the rock just remains unmoved, unchanged, is just constantly there. And so when we learn to connect with this still point, then that becomes my source of stability, of security, of stillness. And that helps me connect with the stillness that exists within me. At the heart of each of us lies a still point that is the eternal self, the true self, the soul, which, is eternal and has always been and will always be. And through meditation, we can learn to connect with that and find our own still point. And, as I see the world changing and look at what is going to be required of us in the years to come, those who haven't made that connection with their own inner self are going to find it very hard to create stability in their lives. And we're witnessing what's going on in Los Angeles at the moment, and the devastation that people are going through. How do you begin to get your head around what's happening there when you lose everything overnight? What is going to sustain you through an experience like that? Well, that's just the start of things. We can only imagine what else is coming down the road at us. So whilst we have this time, this opportunity, let's use it wisely to really learn the art of connecting to that stillness within, that peace within, by connecting with the divine, the supreme, and then making that connection with ourselves as well. And that is the essence of Raja Yoga meditation, which is what we teach at the Brahma Kumaris.
It's a great question. What's going to sustain you? What's going to sustain us as we face the challenges? You mentioned the wildfires. This morning I heard on the news a story about healthcare challenges. And so the question again, what's going to sustain us, whatever, the waves are that are crashing against us in the ocean? And it strikes me that the thing that we have turned away from, which, I'll describe as knowing the deeper self from what you mentioned earlier, is perhaps the thing that's gonna save us.
Yeah. Um, and it's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight, because we're dealing with our own internal constructs, which can lead us down so many different side roads and blind alleys. And I've been doing this for 42 years, and there have been ups and there have been downs. And what is it that keeps you going, keeps you moving forwards? And I think it's, in a way, it's two things. One is learning to take care of myself, learning to nourish myself with good quality reading material that inspires and uplifts me, that I can not work myself so hard that I get into burnout and begin to lose my capacity and my energy. Because once you start going down that road, you can very quickly fall in on yourself, and good habits and disciplines can fall by the wayside. So to really pay attention to my own inner self, my spiritual needs, taking care of myself, really, really important. And the second is really what we spoke about before, is making the main thing in your life the main thing, and not saying this is the main thing, but then other things coming in and crowding out and they become the main thing. And as someone on a spiritual path, the main thing is maintaining that connection with the divine, with the one beyond, with that still point. And I've taken a long time to get to that realization. For many years, I got caught up at the personality level of human beings who were giving the message, and I placed my attention and my focus of thinking on human beings. And at the end of the day, any human being is not going to deliver you um, unchangingly, unmovingly, the peace, the stillness, the joy, the bliss that your soul is desiring. So it has to be a connection with that one beyond. And so those two things, taking care of yourself, taking care of your connection with the God of your understanding. To me, those are the two points that keep you in the middle, one on one side, one on the other side, and here's me in the middle, hopefully moving forwards in the right direction.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Wonderful simplicity in that, but also also a very provocative question. Is the main thing the main thing? So if I say I'm a spiritual person, I have a spiritual practice, it's important to me. Am I am I prioritizing it? Am I making time? Am I making it a priority? Is it the first thing? Or is it the thing that gets squeezed in between all the other things? Maybe doesn't
Absolutely.
happen because there's work, there's this, there's that. So I think that's a great question. Um, so let's think about what's going to sustain us truly in these times, and then how are we going to make that the main thing?
Mhm. Easy to play the game of, well, when I've got my job settled, I can then focus on my practice. When the kids have got to a certain age, I'll have more time and I'll be able to give myself that focus. When my finances have sorted, but something always comes along. I thought I was free of looking after children, and then my mum reached an age where she needed help, and now I'm looking after her. And then grandchildren come along and you get involved. There's always going to be something. So there isn't tomorrow, there is only today. So make today matter, and make sure that you're not selling yourself short by getting caught up in all these side scenes, which will always be there. So it's a wonderful game that we're playing. Of My mum has this lovely expression of learning to dance on a shifting carpet. The carpet is always going to be shifting, but I have to learn to find my balance so that I can move with it and carry on dancing, regardless of this thing I'm standing on that is just like a magic carpet flying through the air.
So we started, Philippa, with a conversation about media, and I'd like to just end with one question about that. How can media help with what we're with? How can media help at this time?
Well, I think what you're doing here with your podcast is a massively important contribution because it enables meaningful conversations to take place that aren't driven by ratings, that aren't driven by, getting a return on investment, because so much of the media is now driven by commercial imperatives. So we also have the whole AI phenomenon that is happening, which is taking us even further away from our organic, essential human selves. So, the media has got us has got such a big part to play in transformation of consciousness, and yet working with the arms of media as they exist at the moment, it's really hard to see how that's going to happen. But I have the faith that it will happen, and that those of us who have a broader perspective that is interested in bringing about world transformation, not just immediate return and immediate satisfaction, but true truth and meaning and substance. That the time will come when they will be coming to us and asking us for our insight, for our inspiration. So, in the meantime, we keep working with the media as it is, knowing that the time will come when, the voice, the spiritual voice, will be the one that is really needed, and people will automatically turn to that. In the same way that in the darkness, you look towards the light coming from the lighthouse, and that sends out a signal which reaches across the ocean. And that's the only source of light there is in the world. If you're sailing a boat at night, and that becomes for you your lodestar, the thing which guides you, which keeps you safe. And the spiritual voice will become that, will become the lighthouse that shines out in a world in darkness. So our job is just to keep that light alive.
And thankfully, we all have the capability now to be sharing content in so many different ways. So we can all be little miniature lighthouses on our shores. So, Philippa, thank you so much for your time today and for the great conversation. Really
It's been a
appreciate it.
pleasure. Thanks, Anne Marie.